Today at the National Press Club, the case for a federal ICAC. Joining the discussion is Serena Lillywhite from Transparency International Australia, Geoffrey Watson from the Centre for Public Integrity and Pauline Wright from the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties. They'll outline why a federal independent commission against corruption is needed. Okay, good.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club, to our Westpac address on an urgent topic, a topic that's before Parliament at the moment, and it's about the case for a National Integrity Commission, something that has bedevilled federal politics for several years now since it was promised back in 2018 and 2019. We've got a great panel to speak on this subject today here at the club. We have Serena Lillywhite, the Chief Executive Officer of Transparency International, somebody who's had 25 years experience in speaking on responsible business practices and on the issue of transparency in politics and business. We also have Geoffrey Watson, a barrister based in Sydney, who specialises in product liability and professional negligence, but has also, of course, been counsel assisting at several large public inquiries, including at New South Wales ICAC. And our third speaker is Pauline Wright, who's President of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties, and Pauline's also the immediate past President of the Law Council of Australia and the past President of the Law Society of New South Wales, with great experience speaking on the issue of transparency in politics and business. What we're going to do is have short remarks from our three speakers, and we'll then go to a discussion on this subject, followed by questions from our journalists in the audience today. So with that, please welcome Serena Lillywhite, our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. I start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, the Ngunnawal people, and I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and the region. And I also acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that might be with us today. My thanks to the National Press Club, to Laura Tingle and David Crowe for the invitation to be here and join this stellar panel for what I think is arguably the hottest political issue going around. The case for a federal ICAC and a National Integrity Commission is clear. It's a no-brainer. We need one, and more than 80% of Australians want one. Transparency International Australia has been calling one for over a decade, and Australia's global standing on corruption is getting worse. While all Australian states and territories have functioning integrity commissions, for too long the view has prevailed that corruption, misconduct and integrity failings somehow, magically it seems, is not a problem among federal politicians. I don't buy that, and the Australian public doesn't buy that. And with trust and confidence in government almost halved from 86% in 2007 to just 41% in 2018, it's hard to understand why any government would not prioritise integrity, transparency and accountability. Integrity, transparency and accountability are values that every politician, every political party should be boldly and proudly nailing their flag to. But instead, the Commonwealth is now the only jurisdiction without an independent, specialist anti-corruption and integrity agency. And you have to ask why. Every year, Transparency International releases its Corruption Perception Index on public sector corruption. The index scores and ranks 180 countries from 0 to 100, with 100 being perceived as most clean and 0 as least clean. Australia currently sits on a score of 77 out of 100. Doesn't sound too bad, does it? But the real story is the downward slide of 8 points in the last 9 years, with Australia dropping out of the top 10 countries for the first time in 2014, and we have continuously failed to lift our game. This analysis is based on aggregated data from organisations such as the World Economic Forum Executive Opinion Survey, the Economist Intelligence Unit Country Risk Survey, and the World Justice Rule of Law Index, among others. And in comparison, Papua New Guinea, a country that last year scored just 27 out of 100 on our index and widely recognised as a high-risk, corruption-prone country, is heading in the other direction. They're heading up the scale, with solid efforts by their government to tackle corruption. In 2020, the PNG Parliament passed legislation to establish an independent anti-corruption commission. And we've done our own research with Griffith University. In 2020, we asked citizens, just how big or small a problem do you think corruption in government is? 66% said it was either a very big problem or quite a big problem. And 85% of respondents told us that they believe that at least some federal members of Parliament are corrupt. The Museum of Australian Democracy's research finds that if nothing is done by 2025 and current trends continue, fewer than 10% of Australians will trust their politicians and political institutions. Now, that is a real worry. Our next Corruption Perception Index will be out on the 25th of January, and it's going to be very interesting to see if Australia continues to slide as we lead into the next election. It's now almost 3 years since the federal government promised to set up an integrity commission within 12 months of being elected, but we continue to wait for a commission that's fit for purpose. The model that has been proposed, has been widely slammed as grossly inadequate. We know a strong integrity commission must have some fundamental design features. It must be independent. It must have broad scope to investigate both criminal and non-criminal misconduct, such as the misuse of public funds. It must apply equally to everyone, without carve-out provisions to exempt ministers and parliamentarians from the same level of scrutiny as the public sector. It must be accessible, allowing members of the public and whistleblowers to raise matters for consideration without fear of prosecution or reprisal. And it must have the powers to hold public hearings when this is necessary and an effective means of investigation, and when it's in the public interest. And you'll hear more about that from both Geoffrey and Pauline. And finally, it must be accountable to the public and not beholden to political interests. For example, disclosing findings both where there is a case to answer and where there is not. And that's one way to address concerns about reputational damage that seem to be grabbing the limelight. If we get this right, and we must get this right, then a Commonwealth Integrity Commission can fulfil its other very important role, that of preventing and deterring corruption and misconduct and having an educational function. This will help send a strong signal of zero tolerance for corruption and misconduct and help restore trust and confidence in government, an issue that must be addressed. The lack of a Federal Integrity Commission is a gaping hole in Australia's integrity framework. It's the most important piece of legislation that we need right now to restore public trust in our democracy. It's the foundation this country needs for solid, forward-thinking policies that put the public's best interest first and always. The single biggest problem for integrity in Australia is diminishing public trust that decision-making is fair, honest and free of undue influence. A strong Integrity Commission is the linchpin of an integrity framework that also needs to demonstrate open and trustworthy decision-making. And to do this, we also need to ensure we have a parliamentary code of conduct, an overhaul of the ministerial standards to ensure transparency and accountability, strengthened oversight of lobbyists to tackle undue influence, transparency and accountability of political donations, and better protection for whistleblowers. Integrity and accountability rely on citizens and whistleblowers speaking up when they suspect or witness wrongdoing. Last week's extraordinary scenes in Parliament laid bare for all to see the resistance to introducing or even debating a strong Integrity Commission that will shine a spotlight on all forms of corruption, misconduct and integrity failings, without fear or favour. I want to commend Bridget Archer, the member for Bass. What she did, crossing the floor to support a motion to debate the Helen Haines, member for Indi, Australia Federal Integrity Commission Bill, was courageous and principled. She showed that to demonstrate integrity, you have to stand up for integrity. The Australian Greens and independents, such as Helen Haines, who sadly had to leave us, others, Jackie Lambie, Rebecca Sharkey, Sterling Griff, Rex Patrick, Zali Steggall, and indeed the Labor Party are now all saying they will stand up for a strong Commonwealth Integrity Commission. And now a wave of new candidates have raised their hand to run in the federal election, and they are prioritising a federal anti-corruption commission. A strong National Anti-Corruption Commission is an idea whose time has come. It is an unstoppable force. In closing, I also want to thank the press for their efforts to expose corruption, misconduct and dodgy deals and decisions. It's the efforts of investigative journalists and their sources that are shining a spotlight on corruption and the abuse of entrusted power for personal or political gain. So to all of the press, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Serena. I wasn't expecting a thank you to the press there at the end, but that was very nice to hear. Now, before I'm going to reintroduce Geoffrey Watson, because one thing I forgot to say about Geoffrey Watson is he's also a director of the Centre for Public Integrity, which has done a lot of very good work on donations reform and also on a case for a National Integrity Commission. So please welcome Geoffrey Watson.
Acknowledgement of country. I'm going to repeat that. I just like a moment like this for people to think about in a ever so slightly different way. I come from Sydney, Serena comes from Melbourne, Pauline comes from Gosford. Wherever we come from, wherever your seat is, wherever you were born, we've all got something in common. That land originally belonged to the first people. I think we can all stop and say, safely, comfortably, we haven't been fair to them. It just hasn't been right. And I just wonder sometimes, every time I hear an acknowledgement of country, I just think, I've got to spend some time, each time I can think of it, to try and do something which would improve their lot. Anyway, that wasn't part of my planned speech. My planned speech has got a name. It's called Bongiorno's Glue. And you know what? Paul Bongiorno's not here to listen to it. I'm so disappointed. I'll explain it. The last 12 months or so, while undertaking this kind of advocacy work, I've been keeping in mind an idea, or I think it might be an ideal, and I call it Bongiorno's Glue. And the inspiration comes from an article written by Paul Bongiorno. I read it a while ago. He identified a range of challenges for Australia at that particular point in time, and especially growing perceptions of corruption and maladministration. And he went on, this is typical of Mr. Bongiorno, in a gentle way, to look for something positive, and he looked for an identifying factor, which he called trust. He said, this is the simple sentence that impressed me. He said that trust was the glue which held our society together. The thinking behind that simple statement is subtle. By identifying the need for a glue, Mr. Bongiorno was pointing to a darker potential. That is, if the government does not maintain trust, then things will fall apart. Things are falling apart. The perception is, Serena's dealt with it, that government decisions are made favourably to friends, unfavourably to enemies, and to advance political or even personal interests. And even where it involves no corruption as such, the perception is that decision-making in Australia is currently unfair. Our powerful and independent Federal Integrity Commission can go a long way toward restoring trust. It should be seen as an ally of good government, not an enemy. And there's no amount of sloganeers ignorantly chanting kangaroo court or star chamber that will put that aside. Now, Serena's dealt with the reason why we need it. I'm going to touch on some of the design issues, and I'm not going to duplicate what Serena had to say, but it is obvious. I'll repeat these 4 essential elements. Commission's obviously got to be powerful. It should be just given the powers of a Royal Commission. It needs to be independent. And by the way, that means amply and independently funded. It needs to have its powers applied equally to all. And it must be open to scrutiny through a parliamentary oversight committee or through judicial review. Everybody agrees with that. But now here are 4 features which, in the area in which I move, people who've studied this, people who've practiced in the area, people who know what they're talking about, 4 features which have universal support except from the current coalition government. And these features are as follows. That is, if the Commission forms a reasonable suspicion of public sector corruption, then that should be a sufficient basis for it to open an investigation. By the way, an investigation is not the same thing as a public hearing. That's a later step. To open an investigation, the coalition model wouldn't permit that. Everyone, including members of the public, should be able to refer a complaint. Can I remind you, as a practical example of this, the Obede inquiry in New South Wales commenced following an anonymous tip-off from a public telephone box. The definition of corruption needs to be sufficiently broad to pick up private individuals and businesses who are seeking to dupe public officials or to corrupt public processes. It's also got to cover, obviously, not only just criminal matters, but non-criminal matters. Now, each of these elements, I think, I'm confident, everybody would agree with them when they're said out loud. Yet each of those 4 features is denied under the proposed coalition model. Now, I've left out public hearings because that's by far and away the most controversial component. It's so misunderstood. People think that, for example, the New South Wales ICAC runs to a public hearing in every investigation that they hold. What a joke. New South Wales ICAC doesn't have the money to do that apart from anything else. It runs 3 or 4 public hearings a year. Things can't be heard in public because there's insufficient funds, but also a lot of matters are dealt with privately. So don't overstate the problem. But it's the most controversial component upon which people fix. Now, I say this, Commission must have the power in certain cases to conduct public hearings. Now, that should be used sparingly, as all of the agencies do, but it must be available. And the reasons why it must be available are pretty obvious. Look, any openness and transparency in public decision-making, even by a body like a Federal Integrity Agency, is a good thing. You know why? It protects us. The role of a Federal Integrity Commission will be not only to find corruption and maladministration, but also to deter it. Well, nothing deters this kind of conduct more than a public airing. Open hearings, public hearings, they earn the trust of the community. It tells the community, apart from anything else, that something's being done to uproot misconduct. Can I just offer you one stark example? This is incredible because it's suggested by the coalition under their model that the hearings would be conducted in private. I'll just offer you this. Just think about this for a moment. It's almost unthinkable. Imagine the Royal Commission into institutional child abuse had been conducted behind closed doors. Nobody would have trusted it. Nobody would have believed it. And it was susceptible to manipulation. And then finally, open hearings do actually engage the public in the process. You know, it's kind of a funny thing. People have gone wild over the public hearings into Ms Berejiklian's recent doings there. The public debate surrounding that itself is a positive thing, not a negative thing. We should encourage debate. There are arguments to be put on both sides. Now, earlier I started by talking about restoring trust. The need to restore trust is because confidence is at an all-time low in our politicians. I'm sorry, Helen, I'm sorry, Mark. It's not directed at you, but it's true. Serena gave you the numbers. And this is partly because of the large number of questionable decisions made in the last few years. Now, some of these just sound financially ridiculous, financially unsound, but others seem more sinister. The fact is, and I'm going to mention 9. They gave me a limited time to speak, so I've just gone for 9. Could keep you here for a while if you wanted. The fact is, we don't really know much about these 9 that I'm going to mention, and that's because we don't have an agency with sufficient powers to require the production of documents or to compel the testimony of witnesses. The police can't do that. The Australian Federal Police has tried. It can't do it. If they don't get cooperation, their investigations just flounder at that point. It's long known by researchers in this area that ordinary policing powers are inadequate to deal with public sector corruption. This has just left a gaping hole in our knowledge about what has happened. Now, we've all read about these things, and this is an unusually well-educated audience compared to some to which I speak. Congratulations. But the point is that memories do fade. I'm going to refresh your memories with the 9 examples. It's just a short list. But I want you to bear in mind when I cite them this. Under the coalition model, there wouldn't be the power to look at any of these scandals. Under a proper model, such as the one proposed by Dr. Haynes, they could be investigated. Here we go. You'll remember them as soon as I say their names, but you may have forgotten some of the juicy detail. And I, for defamation purposes, can't give you everything I've heard about these, but I'll start with the Great Barrier Reef Fund. Why was $444 million given to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, an organisation with no reputation in that area? There was no tender process. There was not even an agreement as to how the money would be spent. This is odd. The foundation, when they were told that they were going to receive this money, described it as like winning lotto. I'm sure that's right, except it was larger than the usual lotto result. A parliamentary investigation into it was just stymied by a lack of cooperation. Another one, politically current, the commuter car parks project. Why? Why was a large part of a $660 million fund allocated contrary to independent advice, away from where the money was needed and towards seats targeted by the coalition? Why? Worse still, the announcement of those allocations occurred immediately before the last federal election. That's only the tip of that iceberg, because the next one is the Urban Congestion Fund. The Car Parks Fund, $660 million, was only a smaller part of a $4 billion Urban Congestion Fund. Preliminary observations made by the National Audit Office showed that the whole of the larger sum had been treated in the same way as the smaller Car Parks Fund. The Audit Office, because incidentally in real terms its funding was cut, didn't have the resources to go into that part of the investigation. Another one, it's got a reputation, Leppington Triangle. Why was $33 million paid in respect of a property valued at $3 million? And even though the property was not essential to the project. People forget that part. It wasn't essential to the project. The land was, I think this is a comical aspect, the land was then leased back to the vendors, reflecting a market rental return on a $3 million property. An AFP investigation floundered in the absence of cooperation. This is the 5th one, the Safer Communities Fund. This is a fund created from the recoupment of proceeds of crime. You know, when they take that money off criminals, they collect it into a fund. One would have thought that that would underline the need to use those funds in a proper manner. Then why? Why, as an exercise of discretion, did Peter Dutton reallocate the funds contrary to the independent advice and toward coalition-targeted seats? 2 of the recipients were located in Mr Dutton's marginal seat. 6, Watergate, our own home-grown Watergate. Why was $80 million paid by Barnaby Joyce to a company, at least historically related to Angus Taylor, to buy water which was valued at $1.4 million. Actually, there's a larger question here. Why am I never the beneficiary of these kinds of deals? Anyway, if you've got the answer to that, could you send me later? But it's not clear. It's not absolutely clear because we don't know a lot about this, but it does look as though the government has never bothered to drop by to collect the water for which it paid the $80 million. The Paladin Affair. How were contracts worth $423 million? This is for providing security on Manus Island. How were they awarded in a closed tender to a company with a registered office in a shed on Kangaroo Island, a company with a questionable financial history? Construct. This is even better. It's a not dissimilar story in which a company with no assets was awarded, without a tender, a contract for $385 million to provide services on Nauru. Now, that arrangement, no tender again, has been rolled over to the benefit of the company, Construct, so that the contract payments now total $1.6 billion. These numbers are astonishing, aren't they? That's partly explained because apparently it costs more than $4.3 million each year to keep each of the refugees on Nauru. Go and explain that one to me. This is the last of the 9. You know why I've left it till last? Because actually there's something really sad about this one. It really gets my goat. The money at stake wasn't as big as the other ones, but there's something I think really quite sad about it. Sports grants. Millions of dollars allocated contrary to independent advice directly toward seats targeted by the coalition. One reallocation we all know was to a club associated with the minister. Another was made to the Mossman Rowing Club. 6 grants were made to organisations which hadn't even put in an application. You know what makes me sad? Top of the list of recommendations was some piss-poor flat field, mainly gravel, in Coaldale, where they wanted to get lighting so kids could practice their soccer and rugby after hours. They didn't get the money, but the Perth Rowing Club did, or Perth Yachting Club, I think it was. They got a lot of money. That's actually just sad, actually, when you move the money like that. You might say these decisions are puzzling, but I'm going to say they're even more puzzling when you know the history. If you know the history, it's that in 2013, the Abbott government campaigned heavily on the basis that Labor had been rorting funds through mismanagement of ministerial discretion. A promise was made that ministerial discretion would be confined or even terminated, but those constraints were relaxed during the successful election campaigns in 2016 and 2019. Do I need to tell you? This must stop. It's got to stop. The predatory misuse of ministerial discretion in allocating public money is not a rumour, it is an objective fact. In recent, very important research, the Australia Institute has shown how, over an 8-year period, involving a $3.9 billion fund, 71% of the money went to coalition seats. Now, that bare statistic might be able to be manipulated, might be meaningless, but the analysis is really, really very careful. It's on the Australia Institute website. They went into it in a deep way. They found that in marginal coalition seats, $184 had been pushed into those seats by coalition decision-making. In Labor safe seats, it was $39 per person. I've finished. Nearly. This not only must stop, it can stop. The National Integrity Commission can do that. It can actually help. It doesn't only deal with investigating corrupt acts, it can actually help with those financial matters. We need one.
Thank you, Geoffrey, and sorry to interrupt at the end there with my terrible timing. But thank you for that. And now please welcome Pauline Wright from the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties.
Thanks very much. It's a real privilege to be here, especially amongst such esteemed company. So, well, Yama, I join you here from Darkinjung country on the central coast of New South Wales, and like Serena and Geoffrey, I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. But I'd also like to acknowledge the Aboriginal youth, because it's in their hands that we hold our hope as a nation for a reconciled future. So, on to the topic of the day. As a civil liberties organisation, the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties has in the past expressed serious reservations about anti-corruption agencies sitting outside established justice system and wielding extraordinary coercive and covert powers. But we've been persuaded. We've cautiously shifted our position in response to the growing threat that increasingly complex forms of corruption pose to the public good in Australia. If the public interest is to be protected against the corrosive effects of serious lapses in integrity and systemic corruption, Civil Liberties acknowledges that the establishment of anti-corruption agencies equipped, yes, with extraordinary investigative powers, albeit with proper constraints and protections, is both necessary and proportionate to the threat. Corruption undermines the integrity of our political system. It distorts the policy-making process, diverts resources, as Geoffrey said, from public good objectives where it can really help, and undermines public trust in our politicians, our governing institutions and public administration. Geoffrey has spoken about Buongiorno's glue. I agree with that. Trust is the glue that holds together the stool of democracy. If you see democracy as a three-legged stool with the legislature, the executive and the judiciary as its legs, if the glue comes loose on any one or more of those legs, democracy topples. That's in no one's interest. So trust is essential. Corruption harms everyone. It breeds inequality and injustice. It undermines confidence in all levels of government and its agencies. They're fundamental to the delivery of citizens' expectations and aspirations for Australia to be a fair, prosperous and ethical society. In 2017, CCL identified the urgent need for a broad-based national anti-corruption agency. It was then that we were persuaded, and we called upon the government at that time to establish it and do it without delay. Here we are, 2021, it's still not there. As Serena indicated, a more transparent and accountable sector would improve public trust and confidence in the government, which has been in serious decline. So what should the scope be if we have an Integrity Commission federally? Well, what do we expect of our politicians? It's essential that our leaders and their agencies act for the good of the public, that they act in the public interest and not in their own private or party interests. If there's evidence that a politician or federal bureaucrat has committed a criminal act, then the criminal justice system works. It steps in already. What's lacking is a body that can investigate activities that don't necessarily amount to crimes. We expect more of our federal leaders than merely not being criminals. Surely Australians would want our Commission to investigate the scandals that have plagued Australian politics. The context and examples given by Serena and Geoffrey are pertinent and underscore the need for a Federal Integrity Commission. But under the Coalition's Commonwealth integrity model, none of those scandals, not the car parks, nor the Sports Rorts affair, neither the Nimrod resources nor the Paladin deal, would be investigated at all. Under the government's model, investigations can't even begin unless a high bar is reached of reasonable suspicion of one of the specifically defined crimes in their model. The State Anti-Corruption Commission's experiences demonstrate that evidence of corruption is typically unveiled during investigations themselves, of course based on credible allegations. But that's what investigations are designed to do, to uncover evidence. You shouldn't have the evidence, you shouldn't need the evidence to begin with. That's what the investigation is for. So if the conduct doesn't meet that high bar, even if there were clear and compelling prima facie evidence of code of conduct breaches or other kinds of corrupt behaviour that don't amount to crimes, the Commission would have no power even to begin an investigation. Such a limited scope would be unconscionable. While criminal conduct should, of course, be a priority for any anti-corruption body, it should be able to investigate other forms of misconduct. For example, as has been said, links between financial contributions and political favours should be explored, even if an improper motive, which is required to meet the criminal threshold, can't yet be established. The flaws in the government's proposed model include that inexplicable division between matters involving law enforcement agencies, where New South Wales ICAC style procedures would apply, in which extended ACLEI functions would exist. That's distinct from public sector entities, including politicians. This would see the public sector and politicians held to a less exacting standard, and whistleblowers and the public would be unable to initiate consideration of an inquiry. Own motions by the Commission would not be able to be initiated. No public hearings could be conducted. No findings of corruption could be made, and no reports could be made public. Where's the trust in a system like that? Any fair and robust National Integrity Commission would hold everyone to the same high standards. Such a commission, in Civil Liberties' view, should have jurisdiction across the totality of national public administration. It should have the power to investigate conduct by a person who's not a public official when the corrupt conduct will have an adverse effect on public administration, allowing investigation of those who seek to unduly influence public decision-making. It should have the power to hold public hearings and issue public reports where it's in the public interest to do so. The decision to exercise this power in individual investigations should be decided based on public interest and fairness criteria, similar to the ones that apply in the New South Wales ICAC Act. It should have the power to investigate without first reaching that evidentiary threshold. The appropriate function of an investigation is to find evidence to determine whether any misconduct has occurred. It should be able to commence own motion and third-party investigations. It should be able to conduct its investigations with the same powers as a Royal Commission and hold those compulsory hearings, whether public or private. It should be able to conduct public inquiries and make public reports wherever it's in the public interest to do so. It may be that in some cases it's not in the public interest, where it would trash someone's reputation unduly, where there is no evidence found. It should be able to make findings of fact to be referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions or other enforcement agencies for consideration of prosecution in criminal cases. And it should be able to make other findings of fact and issue enforceable recommendations. It needs teeth. So what of people's civil liberties? Several civil liberties have to be considered in this context. and have to be protected. They include the presumption of innocence, the right to a fair trial, a person's right not to self-incriminate, the right to equal treatment under the law and due process, the protection of legal professional privilege, and the right not to be defamed. An appropriate model would protect these fundamental rights, as the model proposed by Dr. Haynes does propose. A serious tension exists between the potential for unfair damage for individuals being publicly investigated without the protection of a fair trial before a court versus the undoubted public good that flows from investigation and exposure of corruption through open hearings. The view of the Council for Civil Liberties is that while hearings should be generally held in private, which does happen in New South Wales, and I think in ICAC as well, public hearings have to be available and should occur where the public interest demands it. CCL considers that ICAC's public hearings have overwhelmingly been of public benefit. They've provided transparency and allowed public scrutiny of part of its own operations. So we need to see that ICAC is fair. If we have public hearings, we can see how it operates. They've also exposed corruption in New South Wales and put pressure on governments for reform. Public hearings ensure that proceedings aren't cloaked in secrecy and increase public trust. Widespread corruption has been uncovered by inquiries dating back to the 1980s. Think of the Fitzgerald inquiry investigating Queensland Police. This led to due resignations and imprisonment of corrupt former ministers and officials. There's been criticism that's been referred to already today of New South Wales ICAC's use of public hearings, including from the Prime Minister over the treatment of former New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian. CCL can't agree with those criticisms. That was not an inquiry into the former Premier's personal relationship with a man. It was an inquiry that went right to the heart of political integrity, considering whether in wielding her substantial power as a politician, she breached public trust by exercising public functions in circumstances where she was in a position of conflict between her public duties and her private interest. Whether she engaged in conduct that constituted or involved the partial exercise of any of her official functions in connection with grant funding. Whether her conduct was such that constituted or involved the dishonest or partial exercise of any of her official functions and or breach of public trust by refusing to exercise her duty to report a matter to ICAC. Or whether that was conduct that was liable to allow or encourage the occurrence of corrupt conduct by another, namely Mr. Maguire. These are all proper matters for an anti-corruption body to consider. The former Premier was treated respectfully as a witness to the inquiry and asked proper questions. As former CCL President and former New South Wales DPP Nicholas Cowdery said just today, I think, an assessment of Berejiklian's experience of ICAC provides no basis, as the Prime Minister asserts, for withholding a federal commission or designing one that's intended to prevent political corruption from being exposed as the government would have it. So where to from here? The government should take action to establish a broad-based federal integrity commission as quickly as possible. The time is now. Australia needs stronger freedom of information and whistleblower protection laws and a significant reduction of current secrecy laws. And provisions relating to public administration are integral to a credible and effective national anti-corruption strategy. Further work through COAG to develop a comprehensive national framework and strategy to address corruption and assess the nature, extent and impact of corruption in Australia is essential. But this ongoing project, this ongoing needed work shouldn't delay the threshold decision to establish a broad-based national anti-corruption agency now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline, and also thank you, Serena, and thank you, Geoffrey. We'll go to questions from the journalists here. But first I wanted to ask about something that's really goes to definitions of corruption, because I know you've all spoken about the need to be able to launch investigations, to be able to look at breaches of public trust. But I want to ask, is there a risk in having a definition of corruption that is too broad? Is maladministration too open-ended as a definition of corruption? Is breach of public trust too open-ended? Is there a different way to word it, given that we are going to, sooner or later one day when a bill is introduced to Parliament, have a debate about what the wording actually is? Maybe start with you, Serena, and then Geoffrey and Pauline.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I don't think we need to tie ourselves up in knots about this. The definition of corruption that Transparency International uses is pretty simple. It's the abuse of entrusted power for personal or political gain. And if we keep that front of mind, if we keep that as the definition that we're going to use, then I think it avoids the semantics and keeps us focused on the real issues around whether or not elected officials are using that entrusted power for the benefit of the public good. Are they making decisions that really benefit all of Australians, or in fact are they being diverted or distracted by decisions and by that are really actually only going to benefit themselves and their political ambition? So for us at Transparency International, it's very simple. Keep the definition simple, don't get caught up in semantics, and keep in mind that these are elected officials and we're talking about the abuse of that power that has been entrusted to them for their personal gain or their political gain.
Thank you. Geoffrey?
Well, you've got to be careful here. You don't want to limit it to merely criminal conduct. Yeah. Corruption actually expands well beyond that. So your point is good, David. It's saying, what is it that it expands to? I agree with Serena. When you're talking about it, you're talking about a misuse of public power. You've been entrusted with the power. You might misuse it by, for example, doing a favour for a friend or doing a party political favour. It should just simply carry the idea that you're misusing or abusing the power with which you've been entrusted, especially where there is a designated purpose. I'll just pause there and say it's quite comical in a way that the coalition model proposed is highly prescriptive of the criminal offences which can be investigated by a federal integrity agency, and you'll be pleased to know that one of them is the wrongful discharge of ballast water in a federal port. That's how ridiculous it is. So if you don't wish to tie it down by that prescriptive method, I think that's foolish to do that. You've got to use something general, and then you must trust the Commission. All the better reason for making it open so that the public can have a say. If it says to the Federal Integrity Agency, you're going too far, it can step back.
Okay. Pauline?
Yes, I agree with both Serena and Geoffrey. It's got to be a definition that's an in-principle definition that talks about the misuse or abuse of power in politics for personal or party political gain, and not in the public interest.
Okay. Now, our next question is from Laura Tingle from the ABC and the President of the National Press Club. Laura.
Thanks, David. I'd like to go to that point about personal and partisan corruption or misuse of funds, and not talk about the models as such, but 2 points here. Most of what we've seen in federal politics in terms of the discussion about an integrity commission goes to examples of funding used for partisan purposes, like Geoffrey's very splendid list of various...
Short list.
Abominations, the short list version of your long list. It doesn't actually, in general, talk about examples of personal corruption. So what I'd be interested in you riffing about, as you see fit, is one of them, is it that we don't think there is personal corruption in federal politics, that it's more something that's still done at local or state government level? But also, a lot of these things that we've been talking about, the funding schemes and things, have been revealed by the illustrious National Audit Office. Now, I think it would be sort of useful for people watching this at home to understand what it is that an Integrity Commission can do in terms of addressing these things that the Audit Office has not been able to do. Obviously, there are prosecutorial powers and things, but what is it that they would be able to do, and what role would the Audit Office play in the future with a National Integrity Commission scheme in place?
Well, I'll keep to the order here. Serena, if you want to kick off, and we'll go across.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think the issue of, do people think personal corruption exists in Australia is a really important one. I think too often there is an assumption, well, that just happens in, an African country, or that just happens in Papua New Guinea. But as we know from our own research, a large number of Australians, including those who have previously worked in federal government who responded to our survey, indicated that they had personally witnessed or suspected corruption in its purest form, shall we say, at a personal level. So it does happen. And secondly, I think with regards to the powers or the function of the Auditor General's Office, what we have at the moment is actually a unique opportunity to design not just an integrity commission, but a cohesive integrity framework that is actually going to draw on both the powers and functions of organisations like the Audit Office, but equally supplement those with much stronger powers in terms of the powers of investigation and so on. So establishing a Federal Integrity Commission is not a silver bullet. We still need these other very important agencies to be able to continue the work that they are doing. But it is a unique, potentially once-in-a-generation lifetime to actually design a cohesive integrity framework that has a robust integrity commission as its linchpin, but with those additional pieces of work done around codes of conduct and so on to address the integrity failings that we've got. The other critical issue is that we need to ensure that the Integrity Commission, when it is established, has enough resources. If we set up an Integrity Commission that is poorly funded, then that's not going to get us anywhere. And we've already seen the resources of the Auditor General's Office drastically curtailed at a time when, in fact, an increase in resources were requested.
Geoffrey?
The question about personal corruption, I think, I don't think that there are any people in our Parliament federally who are taking brown paper bags. I truly believe that. It sort of really picks up the point that the operations would be far wider than just merely headed towards politicians. And to look at the public sector generally, and there are bureaucrats. I don't know so much about them, and there are plenty of them. But it also picks up this. It picks up, say, two crooked businessmen colluding to put up the price of a simple contract. In the area of defence, where the spending is so huge, the potential for that is massive. So it's an important component of it. On the Audit Office, the Audit Office is the single most effective integrity agency operating federally today. It's wonderful, it's great, but it can only do what it can do. It now has a budget which allows it, as they best estimate, to conduct 80 audits per year. And bear this in mind, they're not just looking at integrity or corruption issues, they're actually looking generally at broader issues, so they've got to look across the board. I mean, if you listen to the Auditor General, you'll be told the thing we want to find is something where we can pat the people on the back and use that system and take it and encourage other agencies to adopt it. So it's incredibly important, but it would sit side by side. It'd stick there with highly specialised skills in finance, but I imagine that they would be brother and sister agencies and work well together. We've got to keep the Audit Office. It's the only thing we've got.
Pauline?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that the public does think that there is that basic form of personal corruption within politics and in the broader public sector. You only have to think about the Audit inquiry as an example. There was a joke going around Sydney circles when you would open a meeting, you would say, "I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of of this land where we're meeting, the Obedes." So that was sort of, and that was before this was exposed. So there's no doubt that in the public mind there is that personal corruption. So it's important to remember that. But there are other forms that are equally important to root out and expose. But I agree with exactly what Geoffrey said. The Audit Committee would be a sister organisation. They would work hand in hand. They've got different expertise, different powers, but the expertise of the Audit Committee would be brought into play in these investigations.
Our next question is from Andrew Tillett.
Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review. Can I stick with this issue around political gain? And I mean, one man's pork barrel is another man's four-lane highway, sort of thing. The naughty 9 issues that you outlined, Geoffrey, 4 of them were essentially government slush funds that were audited, as we've sort of been narrated. But that's politics, you know. That's been going on probably since the ancient Greeks invented democracy, of trying to win votes by appealing to voters in swing seats. I mean, Pauline's from the Central Coast, that's where I grew up. You know, I mean, it's manna from heaven every 3 years with an election up there, you know, with roads getting updone and things like that. Whereabouts do we draw the line between pork barrelling, and which, you know, is wrong but is essentially a political crime, I guess, effectively?
Really hard.
And you know, normal run-of-the-mill electioneering, vote for me and we'll get a new road sort of thing.
Really, really, really hard line to draw, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. The other thing is that I've said this a few times now, and it's not catching on at all, but I'm going to try it again. Let's stop calling it pork barrelling. Let's call it misusing public money. Let's call it misusing taxpayers' money. Pork barrelling was the sort of thing where the local member got new carpet for the library or got a pedestrian crossing put in. They were small items where local members did something locally. When you're talking about pork barrelling in a $660 million fund, you're right out of line. That's just misusing public money. I think that, yeah, sure, that's a hard place to go. Where's the line? I think you'll find it if you see it. Got to look for it. At the moment, we're only supposing they were pork barrelling because we don't know enough about any of those 9 matters to be confident about it.
In order to move things along, are we okay to go to the next question? Yeah. Which is from Quentin Dempster from the New Daily.
Ministerial discretion is the foundational executive function of Westminster government. Isn't there a real danger with your so broad definition of corruption, given adequate resources, backed up with coercive powers like phone taps, search warrant raids? Every decision by a minister will have to be investigated when people adversely impacted by that decision make a complaint. Every decision. Aren't you setting up another decision-making authority to usurp executive government?
Serena?
Thank you.
I'm very glad to be able to pass it.
Yeah. That's a tricky one. I mean, I guess I think the short answer is no. I don't think we are. I mean, there will always be ministerial discretion, but that doesn't mean that it should be able to happen without scrutiny and without transparency and without accountability. I mean, they are the fundamental principles that any elected official should be operating by. And the very nature of establishing an integrity commission is not just to open the floodgates for any disgruntled person or any member of the public who doesn't happen to like a particular decision to get on their soapbox. It's really about ensuring that we are getting these fundamental principles of integrity, transparency and accountability around how decisions are made, around how discretionary powers are used. And if that doesn't happen, and if it is increasingly characterised by secrecy or not a failure to disclose whether or not somebody did or didn't know about the expenditure of public funds on sports rorts or whatever, then that's where I think this whole issue of trust or declining trust and confidence really comes in. So sure, they have the power for ministerial discretion, but that doesn't mean they can exercise that without scrutiny.
Any other comment from the panel?
Well, I think I should buy in there and say that would have been a question, Quentin, which could have been asked by a courtier of Charles I. The thing is that it's true, ministerial discretion, the executive powers, that's a debatable area how far they go. But there's no problem at all, is there, in subjecting a matter to scrutiny if you trust your Federal Integrity Commission to do the right job. Of course people complain. The bread and butter at ICAC is somebody ringing up and saying, the local government is corrupt because my neighbour's got an extended patio. The thing is that complaints will come and complaints will go, but some of them will be more serious than others. And each of the 9 on the short list would be matters where you would have to say, we need to look at the paperwork. It could well be that the Federal Integrity Agency says, it's fine.
Pauline?
Look, just briefly, I mean, ministerial discretion is of course necessary in a liberal democracy. It's of course necessary, but accountability of the decision-making is fundamental to democracy too. So having an integrity commission that can sort the wheat from the chaff, and it will, there's got to be that triaging of complaints at the first instance, as Geoffrey says, that sorts out the wheat from the chaff. And if we have a good integrity commission set up that can do that, I think we're going to be able to trust it.
Our next question is from Finn McHugh, and before you ask, Finn, we're running out of time. We've gone into overtime, and I also want a question, our last question, from a school student who's turned up here today to ask, and so take it away, Finn.
Cool. Finn McHugh at the Canberra Times. It's been pointed out we have anti-corruption models in all states and territories, and when Gladys Berejiklian resigned, I think Philip Ruddock was talking about the prospect of a Hong Kong-style system here. If you had to take one existing model in its entirety with its strengths and weaknesses for a federal ICAC, what would it be and why?
Thanks for that, Finn. I mean, the Hong Kong Anti-Corruption Commission is often sort of held out as the gold standard or the gold bar of integrity commissions, if you like. And one of the reasons why that is because it has these 3 pillars to it, which include both investigative powers, the prevention powers or purpose, and also an educational role. The interesting thing with the Hong Kong Anti-Corruption Commission is that 90% of all of the cases that come before that commission have been raised by members of the public. And so that's why it is so important that when we do have an integrity commission, that it is accessible and that all citizens and whistleblowers can raise matters of concern. We've seen it work in Hong Kong, and there's no reason why we can't do it here. The sky did not fall in Hong Kong.
New South Wales, without a doubt, follow New South Wales. New South Wales is closely based upon Hong Kong with an important exception. In Hong Kong, the Integrity Agency can also prosecute. We separate those roles. In Australia, we do a better job because of it. But as another answer to your question, I can say certainly not South Australia, certainly not Tasmania. I can work my way backwards. But even the people that I know who've worked in those agencies in other states will say New South Wales.
Okay.
I'd agree with that. I think the New South Wales model is powerful and effective.
Great. Our last question is from Liam Malt from the Canberra Grammar School.
I'm Liam Malt from Canberra Grammar School. So With many young people continuing to lose trust in the federal government, some are looking towards the New South Wales Anti-Corruption Commission as an example for what could be done on a federal level, as you just discussed. However, this argument is often countered by those older than us who sometimes argue that concerns regarding the government's legitimacy in New South Wales are partly due to the Corruption Commission's extent of powers. Drawing from this, my question is similar to the last one. How should a federal ICAC differ from the current New South Wales Anti-Corruption Commission, particularly in respect to its extensive powers and public hearings?
Okay. Serena.
I'll just make one comment. I mean, I think that to pick up on the need to ensure that there is a strong prevention and deterrence mandate built into the design of a Federal Integrity Commission. There must be an element of prevention and an educative function to add to what currently exists within the strong ICAC model in New South Wales, and I'll let others pick up on other elements.
I'd be repeating myself, but I'll add this because it's something that Serena just touched upon. Not widely known. 50% of the work of the New South Wales ICAC is in educative, consultative facilities. They have agencies come in and say, what should we do to control this potential conflict of interest? Or how should we manage this tender process? They also go out and say, this is the way you should design tenders. They do that. That's 50% of their work, and it's really fine. So the federal agency needs to have that in it as well. But otherwise, go New South Wales.
Pauline, the last word to you.
I think that's absolutely right. You could actually just pick up the New South Wales model and transfer it across to the federal system right now. Most of its hearings are done in private. That's the point that needs to be made. The public hearings are only done when it really is in the public interest to have that transparency of the hearing process. So it's a great model.
Can I just say, David, if I may, that I think that is possible to do that, but we also have the opportunity to go further than that and to look at this issue of parliamentary codes of conduct and those other components of a strong integrity framework that's needed. So I think it's actually doing more than just picking up the New South Wales ICAC model. It's got to be part of a cohesive integrity framework.
Great point. And I should add that there are many things that we would have liked to have asked about today, like donations reform, but maybe another topic on another day. I'd like to thank the three of you for coming down to Canberra, or coming up to Canberra today to address this. It's a perfect timing given the parliamentary debate and the lack of the introduction of a Integrity Commission bill into Parliament. But please join me in thanking Pauline Wright, Geoffrey Watson and Serena Lillywhite.